Hello and welcome to our very first Physicians of Culture Philosophy podcast. I'm Glenn McLaren and I'm a philosopher at Swinburne University of Technology. I've been teaching there for around 18 years, and my co-host is the eminent philosopher Arran Gare. And how long have you been at Swinburne, Arran?
32 years.
32 years. Now, the purpose of this podcast is to hopefully introduce to a new audience the work that we've been doing at Swinburne University Philosophy Department for over 30 years now as part of our Complex Processes Research Group. That work delves into areas such as complexity and particular focus on metaphysics and ethics. And in the coming podcast that we do, we'll be focusing on areas such as speculative naturalism, process philosophy, and areas such as that. But today's podcast is focusing on the title of the series, which is Physicians of Culture. Now, Physicians of Culture is a term that was used by Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher. It was his medical metaphor, and it suggests that culture is sick in some way, and that the role of philosophers is to diagnose the sickness and treat it. So we'll be focusing on that idea and also on the concept of culture more generally. Now, Arran, I first encountered you probably 26 years ago, I think now, when I walked into your second year philosophy of culture class. I'd done a bit of philosophy in my first year. I'd come to university as a mature age student, having been in the fitness industry, and I was interested in investigating the nature of the obesity crisis, intending on studying sociology because I understood it as being a social problem. And I got into some philosophy classes in first year and enjoyed them, and so I decided to try a few more in second year. And little did I know that the philosophy of culture class that I walked into in second year would be perhaps the defining class of my oncoming career, and was the class that actually led to me becoming a philosopher and working in the field. I remember walking into that first class and encountering you and thought you were probably the ultimate philosopher, the paradigm of a philosopher. And I remember also being a bit skeptical of some of your arguments in that first class and thinking that perhaps I could prove you wrong in some ways, the arrogance of myself. Anyway, it took me, after 26 years, I'm still trying to prove you wrong in various ways. And I ended up basing most of my work on your work that you've done over the years as well. So that philosophy of culture class introduced me to the importance of the idea of culture, introduced me to the importance of the idea of taking a non-reductionist approach to understanding reality. And it also introduced me to process philosophy, because part of the readings in that course was your book, Nihilism Inc., The Metaphysics of Sustainability, from memory. And I read that book, and it had a big, profound influence on my research at the time and an influence on my life, because it gave me a way in which I could frame the problems that I was looking at in the world, particularly the dialectical approach that you applied in that book. Gave me a way of understanding it, and it gave me a way of being able to frame it in such a way as I could identify the people in the arguments around obesity, for instance, who were actually part of the problem and who were part of the solution. And it allowed me to identify that some of the people who were deemed legitimate in addressing the obesity crisis were actually part of the problem of the obesity crisis, including the very industry that I was working in that emerged to combat the obesity crisis. So that was very enlightening. So I guess what I'd like to ask you is, what does that term, or that term of Nietzsche's, the Physicians of Culture, mean to you? And how is culture so important in your work more generally, or the concept of culture more generally important in your work?
Well, the thing about Nietzsche is that he was a German philosopher belonging to a tradition of thought that was reacting against French and particularly British philosophy. And the notion of culture was developed in Germany, particularly by Herder. Herder argued that every society is held together essentially by a culture. And he used the term in the plural. And you can see this term when it's used in anthropology, talking about the different cultures of different Aboriginal groups or whatever, that they're influenced by Herder. Now, this is in opposition to a conception of what humans are, what nature is, that was being developed in Britain, which didn't have much place for the notion of culture at all. I mean, it didn't really have the concept of culture.
It was more that there was one culture, wasn't it?
Well, they talked about cultivating, the manurance of people, really crude metaphor. But they just assumed that humans were complex machines moved by appetites and aversions, having somehow sensations, some of which were pleasurable and some of which were painful. And life was a matter of increasing pleasure and diminishing pain. And this is the underlying philosophy, essentially, of British society. Well, the German tradition of thought was reacting against this. It seemed abhorrent to treat people this way, and it seemed to be problematic if you looked at it in the context of the evolution of philosophy throughout history. The notion of philosophy was developed by the ancient Greeks. The term came from Pythagoras. It meant love of wisdom. And Nietzsche, in characterizing philosophers as physicians of culture, was also looking at the ancient Greeks. These are the people that he studied originally in the Greek language. So he was steeped in the history of philosophy, in characterizing philosophers as the physicians of culture. But coming out of that German tradition of thought, opposing that mechanical view of the world and treating it not just as somehow untrue, but somehow fundamentally deeply flawed, really a kind of product of a sick culture. In fact, it was the main organizing principle of this sick culture. And for him, it was important to understand how this sick culture can have developed, how it could come to dominate a society, and eventually come to dominate the entire world, because British imperialism, Britain was the biggest empire that's ever existed, and the West Europeans were imposing their culture on the whole of humanity. So the Germans were reacting against that. And
also the problem of nihilism that...
the nihilism is the sickness, and really what Nietzsche was claiming was that it's a nihilistic culture. It just undermines all the values that make life worth living. It's really anti-life.
Yeah.
How can people have embraced such a hideous notion of reality and taken that as the truth?
And he was part of the reaction against that too, with that sort of after that Romantic movement.
That's right.
It was about affirming life, wasn't it?
Yeah. So Herder was a main figure in the Romantic movement. The Romantic thinkers were much more, most of them were German. You had Rousseau and people like Blake in Britain, but the big movement of Romanticism was based in Germany, and Herder was a most important figure in that. And he was celebrating diversity in the world, saying we shouldn't homogenize the world into one way of thinking. You should recognize the significance of these diverse cultures. He wasn't a cultural relativist because he saw culture as evolving through history. But somehow, if you look at what happened, the British were just denying this. And they were still philosophers. They were in the tradition of philosophy as it had developed from ancient Greece, but in a way that involved integrating it with Hebraic thought in Christianity, which involved, refiguring it in ancient Rome. And somehow in that process, humans were turning against life. They were living for the afterlife, regarding the world they were living in as pointless, meaningless.
This is before the world wars. This is before the 20th century. And
oh yeah, this is what you get in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
This idea that the world we're living in is unimportant. We live for the afterlife. Treating the earth as the repository of the grossest dregs of the universe. Somehow the celestial spheres were somehow supposedly better. That was the heavens.
There's sort of a deep cynicism involved, isn't there? Like I always thought too that this mechanical movement just thought that terms like culture were just too difficult, too complex to deal with.
Well, the English dealt with it by redefining culture as high culture. Somehow, sort of reading great works of literature, and you became connoisseurs of literature, that kind of thing. But it trivialized it in the process. It reduced it to a kind of consumption. And apart from the anthropologists and to some extent sociologists, they didn't embrace that German notion of culture. But why did that mechanical view of the world develop? Nietzsche's argument is that it was really a kind of resentment. This is a term that was developed by taking up a term from English language and reformulating it, and it implied hostility to people who were noble, who weren't mean-spirited, small-minded people, and saying that these people are evil. So it was embracing weakness, stupidity, all the rest of it as somehow superior. And
sort of slave morality that Nietzsche talked about.
That's right, the slave morality. The people who are enslaved, resentful of the people who are powerful, and claiming that, okay, well, these people might be okay in this world, but they're going to suffer eternal hellfire after they die. So this is the resentment.
We know that well, don't we?
Well, it was pretty straightforward in the Middle Ages, but what happened in the 17th century was a peculiar kind of thing where that debasement of life and so on was reinforced by characterizing the world as made up of matter operating according to universal laws, facilitating its domination and treating everything as just instruments. And that included other people. Slaves were just things, instruments to be exploited all around the world. You had the expansion, conquest of the Americas and so on, and enslaving the populations, enslaving the Africans. And they were then things, objects to be manipulated and controlled efficiently. In the 17th century, you transformed the relationships between people so that people were reduced to wage slaves. That is, that they were deprived of access to the means of production, forced to sell their creative potential as a commodity, and just looked upon as means to make profits. But it was still supposedly in the interests of the afterlife.
Yeah.
Then in the 19th century, they just did away with the afterlife. They did away with God and all that. And you ended up with this totally meaningless world.
And you had the deist belief emerging in the 19th century too, didn't you?
Yeah, you'd had that. But I think the biggest thing was that, with Darwin, you erased God. So you, first of all, projected all meaning onto God, or the source of meaning onto God. Then you did away with God, leaving us with this empty, meaningless world of matter in motion, in which the only thing that could be regarded as good was having pleasure.
And how much of this do you think was due to philosophers, or at least intelligent people, trying to justify their own bad behaviour?
Yeah,
in a sort of sophisticated way.
It's sort of peculiar because it enabled people to behave really badly and then confess and get absolution for their sins, and that enabled them to just continue on the way to heaven.
Or in a more scientific sense, just argue sort of from a deterministic perspective that that's just the way things are.
That's right. Everything's predetermined.
It's natural.
Is, set up by God so that the laws of nature are immutable. And it's really interesting looking at the notion of laws of nature, because it implies somebody who formulated those laws, assumed a God that was organizing the world to be predictable and controllable. But when you did away with God, you still retained that language. And then you said that, well, not only physical processes mechanical, living beings are mechanical, and then humans themselves are just mechanical, stimulus-response mechanisms. And what that course was about was showing that this is the conception of humans that dominates mainstream psychology and economics, which are the most influential human sciences. They claim to be on the side of science. Science is the ultimate arbiter in matters of belief. And if you take that science seriously, this is how you have to view the world. And if you look at the consequences of that, it's not just that people were pursuing pleasure. You get this with the market, so that people supposedly maximizing their profits so they can consume more. But at the same time, it destroys community. It produces even more resentment. And then you get the rise of fascism, where you define who you are by hatred of the other. And you look at Nietzsche and you can see that he predicted what happened in the 20th century, the rise of fascism.
Because you sort of have this strange paradox, don't you, where you have this atomism that's at the heart of the scientific approach. But at the same time, then you have these sort of mass movements occurring, where
That's
everyone's
right, yeah.
supposed to be conform.
That's right. And these are clearly dialectically related, and people don't understand that if you embrace neoliberalism, promoting freedom from any constraint, you destroy community because you treat everyone as just instruments for your own satisfaction. You end up concentrating wealth, undermining economic security, and that's within nations, but also even more between nations. And then the reaction to that, when you've got no values to uphold, is you gain meaning from your life through hating the other. So the two go together.
Yeah.
And this is why you need philosophers to point this out. People tend to just have a simplistic view of things, but you need philosophers to look at the whole history of this, how it developed, how the cultures developed. And this is what Nietzsche was doing, explaining how you'd ended up with this sick culture. And the notion of sickness is really important because it implies a notion of health. And health is a really interesting concept when you look at it.
Yeah.
The term derives from the notion of wholeness.
That's right, yeah.
So it's got values associated with it, and it's perhaps one of the few concepts that hasn't been debased. So upholding the notion of health of culture, upholding the notion of culture in that sense that Herder developed it, so that we can see that we don't have to just live with this culture. We can question it and reformulate it, look at its basic assumptions, see how they developed, and transcend it, create something different.
Yeah, you understand how concepts such as reductionism and atomism and fragmentation are anti-health.
That's right, they are.
Yeah.
And they provide poor means to fight for health. And perhaps this fits in with your obesity crisis, that the people who purported to be addressing the problem were actually making it worse because they're fundamentally defective thinking about what's involved.
Yeah, through particularly a focus on individualism and individual weakness in the face of problems such as obesity.
Yeah, and then, why do people eat too much? When they're economically secure, you don't address that problem.
Yeah.
The same with having a third of the young people having psychological problems, and you say it's an individual problem. Well, it's clearly not. It's a problem of the whole society and the culture of that society, and that culture upholding social institutions which are fundamentally defective.
So neoliberalism itself can be understood as a culture, can't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
It's actually a revival of that 17th century cultural revolution, if you understand it in terms of Herder and so on, which was associated with upholding what purported to be liberty, but redefining it as freedom from any constraint. And that facilitated the people with power reducing everyone else to just instruments of their own ends, ultimately to concentrate wealth and so on. It's a fundamentally defective culture, but the thing is that it eliminates the notion of culture, so it doesn't recognize itself as a culture, or it redefines culture so it doesn't acknowledge that it itself is a culture, which implies that it can be questioned and replaced.
Or as I've written before, it can be also described as anti-culture in some ways, because I always go back to that original understanding of culture as you say, as being cultivating.
Yeah, that's right.
As applying to creating the conditions for the growth and development of life, for instance.
Yeah, that's right.
And so then you can understand those movements or ideas which are against life or inhibit the emergence and growth and development of life as being opposed to culture in some way.
That's right. Well, you think about the ancient Greeks; they were concerned about cultivating the virtues. The 17th century revolution put everything upside down. So what you're effectively doing was cultivating vices of greed, self-interest, short-sightedness, treating people as instruments.
It's very pertinent today, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Not having any respect for the community of which you're part and what's involved in upholding and maintaining that community. The virtues required for a healthier society. So it is anti-culture in some sense, but it's still also a kind of culture, a sick culture.
So you can cultivate, for instance, some nasty viruses.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that that's effectively what we've done. And it's not just that we've cultivated that greed, we've cultivated this propensity for fascism, this tendency to define yourself, to give yourself a sense of significance by hating others, looking at them as not fully human, justifying, incredible brutality towards them, that kind of thing. And this is happening all around the world. You've got this growth of fascist movements along with neoliberalism, and the two are connected.
And you can use these cultures as a way of almost becoming a psychopath, like even though you're not one. They could be structures that allow you to act like a psychopath.
Yeah,
even
well,
if you're not.
Perhaps they are. I mean, the trouble is psychopath is term from psychology, but the sense in which a lot of people are basically psychopaths. I mean, they don't have any sense of empathy. They don't seem to be able to empathise with others, to consider the implications of people being hideously killed and what effect that has on other members of their communities.
Like what's happening now, yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of our political leaders, when you look at them, really are psychopaths. And when you think about, the biggest problem of all we're facing, the global ecological destruction, this is going to kill billions of people.
Yeah.
And they're preventing effective action to deal with that. And thinking that they're clever in doing that, and they do it in all sorts of subtle ways. They promote tokenism. So instead of, first of all, they deny climate change, and then they say, oh, yeah, we believe in climate change, but it's going to be solved by allowing markets to operate where people trying to make profits will make profits out of addressing the problems. And you have this tokenism. They must know that they're paving the way for the destruction of civilization.
Yep.
And you have to try and understand, well, how can they behave like that? And you can't understand it just in terms of individuals, which the notion of psychopaths implies. And this is why you have to get back to Nietzsche's notion of philosophers as physicians of culture and get back to that notion of what a culture is and how that culture relates to everything else. That is the structure of society, the way people are formed as individuals. The notion of culture is at the core of it, understanding what humans are. And what I was trying to show in that course was that this is the conception of humans that is actually most defensible. This is based on developments in the natural sciences, which have actually replaced the mechanical view of the world.
Yeah, that's right. That was interesting to me to see how so much of what you were saying was actually in accord with developments in modern science.
That's right. And it's associated with a reaction against the very mechanistic view of biology that animals are just complex machines formed by their DNA, recognizing that they're living beings, that they define their environments as their worlds, that they respond to, that have meaning for them. And it's introducing meaning into the world, that the world isn't meaningless. So this is what you find in the biosemiotics. And the biosemiotics then enable you to work out what's unique about humans, which is that...
So just explain who biosemiotics are for a moment.
Well, they're the people who argue that to understand life, you have to recognize that central to it is the production and interpretation of science.
Right.
And that is the basis of the organization of the organism. That if you think about DNA, it's actually a science system that is passing I suppose, kind of knowledge from one generation to the next about what kind of world this organism that develops is going to enter into, and what it needs to do to respond properly to that world.
So this really gets to the heart of what that philosophy of culture course was about in terms of introducing greater complexity into the understanding of human behaviour.
That's right.
And what it introduced me to was a non-reductionist approach. Once I understood that you could understand it through the concept of culture, and understanding that these were, social movements and cultural movements, etc., then things like you introduced Hegel's three dialectical patterns.
That's right, yeah.
As a non-reductionist approach to understanding different cultures, which then made sense. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So if you think about semiosis, you can see that there's more and more complex forms, and you get a kind of reflexive semiosis, and this is unique to humans, the symbolic kind of semiosis, and this facilitates the development of with reflexivity. The capacity to put yourself in the perspective of others. And you do this in different ways. One is obviously through language, and Herder argued that language is absolutely central to culture. So when we're using language, we impersonalize what we're saying, so that the words have not an immediate, they have a kind of immediate meaning, like, birds communicate and you have an immediate response to the sounds they make. But in the case of humans in producing language, the language has an objectivity to it. It transcends the conversation. So it's something that can be understood by anyone. And in speaking, you appreciate that. So that's one way in which you transcend your immediacy. And it's by virtue of this that you have a sense of your being an I among other eyes, that a subject among other subjects. You're looking at yourself from a perspective outside yourself. Having the appreciation of the possibility of the world continuing after you're dead. Animals are egocentric in a sense. They don't have that capacity.
Yeah.
That's one way, and this is what Herder was focusing on. Fichte, who was influenced Hegel, said also there's a kind of mutual recognition associated with setting up institutions that have an objective standing. And it's again facilitating a sense of yourself as positioned within these institutions. So you have family members, for instance, and you recognize yourself as being part of that family. But the family, being recognized symbolically as transcending the individuals who compose it. And then the third dialectic is the use of tools. Now, chimpanzees use tools, but they don't see a rake as something that's been produced for a particular purpose.
Right.
They just use it because it's in their immediate environment. Humans recognize a whole realm of instruments, and it's not just tools, it's houses, roads, all those things, produced for ends that transcend the individual. And in participating in a community, you're participating in these three dialectical patterns of by which you develop a sense of who you are.
And that dialectic of labour includes all of those different structures that we create around the labour process too, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And the thing about those three
way in which we organise
patterns,
work and all those sorts of things are included within that.
Yeah, that's right. The three dialectical patterns are interpenetrating and dependent upon each other, but not reducible to each other. And one of the sicknesses of our culture is the tendency to focus on, the dialectic of labour and, the development of instrumentality.
Which Karl Marx did, of course, to a certain
criticised, because then instead of recognising the importance of recognition as important in its own right, associated with the quest for justice, proper recognition of people, you ignore that and say, we've got to be efficient.
Yeah.
So you just treat people as instruments.
That's
and
right.
In fact, you end up undermining even what you're striving to achieve. The same with the dialectic of representation, associated with language. Language facilitates the development of art, literature, philosophy, and science. And these have an autonomous dimension to them, in that they uphold ends that transcend just knowing the world so you can control it. we want to understand the world to find what meaning there is in the world, those kind of things, to define ourselves. But if you transform science just to a means to develop technology, and you deny any validity to any discourse apart from that, except as entertainment, you actually destroy even the capacity to organise your labour. So this is what you're facing at present, with neoliberalism, a global ecological crisis, economic crisis.
And a sort of a hyper-specialisation where people get this blinkered view of the world.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so that also facilitates their domination. So you promote specialisation so that you can more effectively control people, because people can't organise anymore. They need managers, and the managers are the people who uphold that very instrumentalist way of thinking. And management science tends to be dominated by Taylorism, which is really treating people as just instruments to be exploited efficiently.
But that separation of, as you say, the dialectic of labour from recognition is central to our ethical crises, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So you have the debasement of the notion of justice. And it's really interesting in Australia, if you think about the notion of fair go, that's associated with the notion of justice.
Yeah.
And it indicates to some extent how we're influenced by that German tradition of thought reacting against that mechanical view of the world. The Federation of Australia, the British idealists influencing Australia, which in turn was, sort of reviving. It was a renaissance, a rebirth of ideas from ancient Greece. So it's essentially the Aristotelian notion of justice that we embraced as a nation. We've just turned our backs on that, just ignored it.
Yeah, so this is the dialectical nature of it that you identify, in that these qualities we have, these ways of thinking we have, they exist. In many ways, they're more fundamental to who we are in some ways.
Yeah.
But they get masked by this other side, this mechanical way of thinking.
Yeah. Now,
there's always this continual problem of one dominating the other.
That's right, yeah. Now, talking about the dialectic of representation, you can see just how important it is if you think about history. Now, history is associated with remembering the past.
Yeah.
Now, animals live in a permanent present, not just the instant, but they don't think long term.
No.
Humans have the capacity to think about the origins of life, the origins of humanity, the whole lot. Every discourse is held together by a kind of history. You can't do science without having the history of science to appreciate what's been achieved in the past, what are the current problems, and what we should be aspiring to in the future. And
yet apparently there's been a 30% drop in history being taught in Australia.
That's right. And it's not just a lack of studying of history, it's people having no sense of history, people having no sense of where they've come from. And, if you're trying to understand why you've got this growth of psychological problems in the young, they've got no sense of history. They've got no sense of what their community is, where it's come from, how it's developing, what it should be aspiring to. The understanding of the world is just becoming fragmented.
And those healthy cultures are the ones that usually do have that
sense of history.
Continuity, that sense of history.
Yeah, and an image of the future that they're aspiring to, which requires history to, define the present. But
this has been poisoned, of course, by various totalitarian regimes that have emerged over the years, who have obliterated history in order to write their own history.
Well, they often try and impose a history and a falsified history. You could see this, with the Soviet Union, for instance, or Nazi Germany, a falsified history. What we've got now is something that's even sicker. That is, what you do is you promote such a diversity of points of view and perspectives that people just can't make sense of it anymore. You don't have censorship. You have this massive overproduction of trivia and fake science and so on. And people just give up. They can't make sense of things anymore.
So I think people don't make the connection between the idea of a post-truth society and its sort of demolition of history, or its delegitimization of history in some ways,
Yeah.
Like history is no one can trust history anymore. No one knows what the truth is of history anymore. So
That's right, yeah.
we abandon it.
And you can see this even in the natural sciences. Physics has lost its way partly because they don't have historians of science working out what's been achieved. So when you come to things like quantum theory, there are 30 or so different interpretations, and they've got no way of assessing, which interpretation should be embraced. They don't look at the relationship between the different disciplines and see how, advances in one might reflect upon what you should accept in another discipline, because it's all fragmented. So even in medicine, you often go backwards, but people can't even work out whether we're going forward or backwards because we've got no proper sense of the history of the disciplines.
Well, I saw a recent report from a pathologist suggesting that the mumps vaccine would be very effective against COVID. And she was arguing that, we're always, whenever crises like this emerge, we're always trying to find something new, usually because it generates a lot more money too. But she says there's often things, people who know, there's often things that are still there that can be used.
Yeah. One example of, ignorance, this fragmentation, during the Second World War, you had problems of mines blowing up ships. And people knew how to deal with those, but they were specialists. And the people who were in charge of trying to solve the problems didn't know about that specialist knowledge. So for a long time it was a huge problem that all these ships are being blown up. But you need these people who transcend specialisation to be able to appreciate how knowledge can be used in different areas.
Yeah. That's sort of that idea of institutional knowledge, history, that. Yeah.
But when your institutions are all fragmented, and the latest techniques of managers is to continually restructure so that you destroy any centres of power so that you can control people more effectively.
And the dementia is obvious, isn't it? Because they're always usually reintroducing something with a different name or a different package that's been done before.
Yeah, but often forgetting a lot of what was understood in the past.
And plagiarising in a sense as well,
Yeah. So you tend to go backwards. Abandoning the humanities, and abandoning history, abandoning philosophy, abandoning the history of philosophy. So when you lost that history, people have really lost their bearings. So talking about, sickness of culture, you can see how it's got far worse than when Nietzsche was writing. So Nietzsche was predicting, a lot of things that happened in the 20th century which were appalling. Yeah. To some extent predicting the rise of Nazism and so on. Now we've got something that's even more hideous. You read Hitler, at least he was an environmentalist. Now we've got the possibility of destroying the whole of humanity.
Yeah, I know. It's amazing.
So the notion of health is, as I say, a really important concept, and trying to work out what that involves, looking at what a healthy culture is, one that facilitates the full development of people's potential to augment the life of their community. But all the words you're using, problematic, because they tend to be debased. If you think about life, what people want is a vibrant community, which means life. We've got all these terms where we do uphold life, but then we've got a mainstream biology trying to explain away life, saying that we're just biochemical reactions controlled by particular molecules, and nothing but that. Nothing but. That's really what reductionism is.
Yeah.
And then you say, well, why? Why are these people dominating like this? I mean, one of the problems, philosophers of biologists, philosophers of biology, showing the limitations of mainstream biology, were being totally ignored by the biologists who stopped their students studying studying philosophy.
Yeah.
Why? I don't think you can explain it just in terms of petty little tyrants wanting to control their little domains. There's something deeper involved, and this is where the notion of resentment comes in.
Well, a good example is that I've had a number of students over the years, psychology students, who've enrolled in my philosophy classes and come out the other end dropping out of their psychology major.
Yeah.
Because they're able to recognise the deficiencies in psychology.
Yeah.
And the problems and the reductionism involved. So, yeah, you can see they have a vested interest in stopping their students from enlightening themselves more.
That's right,
in
yeah.
a sense.
But why do the psychologists embrace these debasing notions of what humans are? And, I'm suggesting that it's connected to this failure to face up to the fact that we're destroying the global ecosystem, which could destroy billions of people's lives. There's something really sick about people debasing life.
There's a real sense of a retreat into smaller and can be a sort of predictable reaction. People retreating into smaller and smaller spaces that they can understand in the face of this sort of growing complexity. Yeah?
But always associated with debasing what people are, what life is, and working out to some extent how to control what they're studying. But there's something worse than that. There's something vicious about it. This refusal to acknowledge the reality of life, turning against life. And I think that that's what Nietzsche was trying to highlight or reveal. What is it about our society that's produced these people who are so anti-life?
Well, we've talked before, haven't we, about the problems of insecurity.
Yeah.
And how the phenomena that we always notice of insecurity then breeding a form of arrogance as a defence, if you like.
Yeah, it can. So that kind of arrogance is another defective response to a poor situation. Why don't people more wholeheartedly just really reject, this defective culture and uphold higher ideals? And that seems to be, a really big problem, trying to understand why. It's somehow, they're being socialised into a defective culture in a way that reinforces and reproduces this anti-life orientation.
Well, I guess Australia is a good example, isn't it? Because we pride ourselves on being a multicultural society. But at the same time, there's no sense in which what is our culture more generally? Where is our culture going? What is the bigger part of the culture that we're part of, apart from being a bunch of mates or whatever? Or
if you think about multiculturalism, and that's associated with cultural relativism, and relativism can be used to just undermine any beliefs. And there's an alternative to that. I mean, you can just impose one culture and say, everyone's got to accept this one culture. But there's another alternative, and that's transculturalism. This is where you recognize diversity and say that that's really important, because with diversity, you can reveal the deficiencies of each culture and they can learn from each other. So this is transculturalism. Now, why hasn't transculturalism been accepted and taken off? It's available. People have been talking about it. And
so this is from the particularly the Russian philosopher Mikhail Epstein.
That's right,
who influenced you at one stage, didn't he?
That's right.
Yeah.
So what puzzles me is when you've got these brilliant ideas and you talk to people about these ideas and their eyes just glaze over. There's something sick about these people, that they're not really wanting better outcomes. They're not wanting something that's superior to what they've got. What they've got is clearly inferior, defective, and yet they're not willing to even countenance alternatives to their own thinking.
So we have this problem now too, where we can't make these evaluations of different cultures because of this sort of postmodern condition of cultural relativism, where we can't say whether one culture is better than another for fear of sort of political correctness.
That's right. Political correctness is a way of closing down dialogue, so you can't question anything anymore. And it purports to be radical, tolerant, but in fact it's the exact opposite. What it's really doing is preventing people thinking about how things could be better. It prevents people questioning the limitations of their own way of thinking and moving to something better. It's again a kind of anti-life thing, purporting to be something superior, purporting to be tolerant. It's again one of these peculiar things where what looks like and purports to be something superior, more noble, is in actual fact the exact opposite of what it purports to be. And this became evident in Western Australia, where I came from. People were striving to overcome the apartheid kind of system in place, trying to get education for Aboriginal children who people in country towns didn't want to have sitting next to their children in school. Then you had this postmodern thing where a whole lot of people came along and said, Aboriginals don't need education because they've got their own culture. You ended up with a generation of people who are disempowered by being rendered illiterate. Sort of reproducing that apartheid that people have been fighting against.
And we still see today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
which showed itself in the voice referendum we had here as well.
Yeah. It's associated also with kind of stupidity. Einstein said that there are two things that are infinite, the universe and human stupidity. And he said, I'm not sure about the former. Now, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was opposed to Nazism and eventually was executed because of that, said things are bad because of two things, malice and stupidity. And he thought that stupidity was actually a bigger problem. And stupidity is where people just refuse to think. They refuse to see the implications of what's going on. And this is what was happening, with the rise of Nazism in Germany. But you can see that a feature of stupidity is people just uphold contradictory beliefs. They hold beliefs that are going to have disastrous consequences, but they just refuse to think out the implications of what they're doing.
And this is worse because, you see this in universities as well. At least with malice, you can identify, there's sort of a logic there. You can identify an evil or or an enemy or whatever.
That's right.
With stupidity, it's just there's no dealing with it. There's no argument with it. There's no reasoning with it.
That's right.
It's like
it's combined with that postmodern relativism and political correctness that upholds stupidity,
and it's embedded in the system. This level of stupidity, because so many bad decisions we see are not so much the result of a will to do evil, but it just incompetence in many ways.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And then you can sort of uphold fundamentally defective beliefs, which involve forms of fascism. Sort of dehumanizing the other.
But then this people wanting to defend their incompetence, recognizing that they're not very smart or they're stupid or whatever, but then wanting to defend themselves against smart people, revealing their problem. Yeah,
that's right. And again, you can see that it's a new form of the resentment that Nietzsche was identifying and trying to fight against. Now, I was talking about the consequence of what Nietzsche was talking about was the rise of Nazism, the incredible grotesque brutality, but the vulgarity of the whole thing. And then after the Second World War, there was a real reaction against it, and people like Nietzsche were very influential. You had the whole existentialist movement, for instance, where they studied Nietzsche and developed his ideas. What happened after the 1970s was a turning against that. So, the movement to overcome that nihilism was subverted, despite enormous progress in, challenging that nihilism, not only in the humanities but also in the natural sciences. All that's sort of been marginalised, and it's been marginalised, well, partly through the revival of neoliberalism, but it's not just that, because the lack of effective opposition to it, even by people who are being adversely affected by it, is something that you have to, explain.
Yep. Well, I guess we can't do it all here in one podcast, but hopefully we've made some headway. So I hope you enjoyed that. Today's podcast was looking at the concept of physicians of culture and looking at the importance of culture in our understanding of the range of different crises that humanity is facing at the moment. And in our next podcast, we will start to look more deeply at some of the philosophical foundations underpinning the work that we're doing at Swinburne University of Technology, the foundations that are underpinning these concepts of culture that we were talking about today. So thanks, Arran.
Oh, thank you
for having a talk today, and we'll see you in the next podcast.